Hello, everyone. This is recording number 5 for Plato, a class on the Republic. Today, I want to talk about tripartition, the view that the soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and appetitive desire. And this view is developed in Book 4 of Plato's Republic. There is a lot of scholarly dispute about how best to interpret this view, about how to make sense of it, whether there are some really strong objections against it. But I want to set most of this aside. I'm just going to mention first what is one of the most intense scholarly discussions about tripartition in current literature, and what has been really widely debated in, let's say, the past 10, 15 years or so. And then I turn to another dimension that is somewhat less debated, but equally puzzling and interesting. So here's the first widely debated issue. Plato's proposal is that reason, spirit, and desire each have a cognitive and a desiderative dimension. What does that mean? Reason, of course, fundamentally engages in reasoning and thinking, but it also has desires. Reason loves truth and knowledge, and judges truth and knowledge to be good. And truth and knowledge are, as it were, the natural objects of reason. And something analogous holds also for spirit and appetitive desire. Spirit has a natural object, namely victory and having a good reputation. And that is what spirit desires. But it is also what spirit judges to be good. And in the case of appetitive desire, the thought is that, well, the natural object is something like food and drink and so on and so forth. And appetitive desire, or the appetitive part of the soul, desires food and drink and so on, and it also judges food and drink and so on to be good. So the puzzling or interesting idea here is that reason also desires things and loves things and has, as it were, affective attitudes. And the other two parts of the soul are not purely affective or desiderative. They also judge something to be the case. So they also have a cognitive dimension. And I just want to invite you to think further about that idea, also with the help of the secondary literature that is listed on our syllabus. The other kind of puzzling and interesting dimension of Plato's proposal that I want to mention is somewhat less resolved in the literature. Or another way of putting this is there isn't a scholarly consensus on this or that. Rather, scholars have mostly kind of carved out some questions. So here's the proposal. The proposal is that there is a distinction between qualified and unqualified desire. What does this mean? This proposal is introduced with respect to appetitive desire. And Socrates says that hunger and thirst are kind of the clearest and somehow strongest examples. And the thought is that, let's say, someone could be just thirsty in an unqualified way. You're just thirsty. But you could also be thirsty for a cold drink or hot drink or for coffee or green tea. And similarly with hunger, you could be just plain hungry in an unqualified way, but you could also be hungry for something specific, for a piece of cake, for a plate of pasta, whatever. And Socrates' interlocutors are somewhat puzzled by the fact that this is introduced as an important distinction. They don't quite know how to make sense of it, and that is also somehow the position that scholars find themselves in. The discussion of this proposal is quite technical, and it comes up early in the text about tripartition. So my view is that we should take it seriously and that Plato by introducing it early and by introducing it in a somewhat technical way, is as it were saying, well, this is something that we should get clear about. This is something where we need a certain level of precision. However, because it is so disputed and in many ways unclear, there is often a tendency to almost treat it as a digression and to set it aside. And certainly in depictions of tripartition that are at a somewhat introductory level, it is treated as a digression and pretty much just, people just skip it. But I want to, just illustrate a little bit why it could be important to think more about it. When you think about these examples for appetitive desires as qualified and unqualified, being either just plain hungry or hungry for something specific, you might think, well, maybe that is a dimension of appetitive desire, but you might also think, well, maybe that is a dimension of desire in general. Because you can easily come up with examples where desires of spirit or desires of reason could fit the same pattern. So, for example, someone could have a kind of paradigmatic desire of spirit, namely a desire for appreciation. And someone could have that desire in an unqualified way. They just want appreciation from, anyone. But they could also have a desire for appreciation by one particular person. This is the person whose approval and appreciation matters to them. So that would be a distinction between an unqualified desire for approval and a qualified one. Similarly, with respect to the desires of reason, we could come up with examples that are really rather familiar. For example, consider students starting out in college. It is frequent that someone starts out in college not quite knowing what they want to study, but they know they want to study. So you have an unqualified desire to learn, but you don't yet have a qualified desire to learn. And then you take a couple of classes and you reflect upon the material that you encounter and you have conversations and so on and so forth. And eventually you have a qualified desire to learn. And now you want to learn, let's say, about chemistry or about art history or whatever it might be. So the distinction does seem to apply. Now, you might think, well, but nevertheless, it is introduced with respect to appetitive desire, not with respect to the desires of spirit and reason. But then you might also think that Plato might be quite interested in also these other phenomena. So, for example, later on in the Republic, he describes philosophers as people who love all learning, all wisdom. And then you might wonder, well, is he saying that philosophers are those who have an unqualified desire for learning? Whereas maybe the rest of us have a desire to learn about this or that, but not a desire to learn anything and everything. So it is quite conceivable that Plato would be open to entertaining the distinction between qualified and unqualified desire with respect to all desires. And I just sort of want to leave you with this question. There are a number of further questions. There is also the question of how the qualified, unqualified distinction fits together with what seems to be Plato's most basic premise, namely that desire is for the good. That is a big discussion. And there are further puzzles. But all I want to do really is to flag that even though in some respects, as in the respect that all three parts of the soul have a cognitive and a desiderative dimension, scholars have already reached some kind of consensus. There are other respects of what Plato is putting forward where there is still a lot of work to be done.